Let's go ahead and take a look at cost push inflation and see how it is similar and different from demand pull inflation. So cost push inflation is a negative supply shock that reduces output and raises prices. And in this scenario, this is actually a scenario that every single country and nation would like to avoid because the end results are going to lead to some type of trade-offs and they can't necessarily reach the best economic outcome in this scenario or this situation. So let's go ahead once again detail step by step the idea behind cost push inflation and see why the results are going to require some type of trade-off. So here, take a look at cost push inflation. With cost push inflation, once again, we're going to start off in long-run equilibrium, and this is going to result when the supply shock hits the economy. So results when the supply shock, hits the economy, and reduces SRAS. So the short-run aggregate supply curve, and we end up with lower prices, lower output and higher prices. So lower output and higher prices, and once again, in order to differentiate cost push inflation with demand pull inflation, we have a negative supply shock that happens first. So negative supply shock happens first. So it doesn't really matter, once again, what the negative supply shock is going to be. It can be something that deals with productivity, with technology, taxes, regulation. As long as it's a negative supply shock, when we're in long-run equilibrium, that is going to begin the sort of the beginnings of cost push inflation. And once again, we want to go ahead and detail, once again, the sort of graphical results of cost push inflation and compare it to demand pull inflation. So once again, start off in long-run equilibrium. Our favorite step, just drawing out all these curves. LRAS, SRAS 0, AD 0, we have price level, and we have output. And once again, we are starting off at point A, we have Q star, and we have PL0 price level. So once again, start off with a negative supply shock. So here, I'll draw this in orange right here, a negative supply shock. So SRAS is going to be affected. We're going to shift our SRAS curve over to the left, and we have SRAS1. So here we are at point B, and what do we notice about point B? We are in short-run equilibrium with higher prices and a lower amount of GDP. So we're at PL1, and we have Q1 level of GDP. So we have higher prices, there's some type of inflation, but we also notice that, hey, we are in a recession now. So what do you think is one of the ways that we can get back to a particular equilibrium point? So the thing that probably comes to your mind, first of all, is, hey, we want to go ahead and get out of the recession. Economies don't like to be in recession. The government doesn't like to be in recession. Let's go ahead and find a way to get out of the recession. And one way we can do that is by affecting our aggregate demand curve. And we can go ahead and increase our aggregate demand curve with spending increases. It's going to be affected by the multiplier. And when we increase aggregate demand as such, we go to AD0 to AD1. That can exactly help get us out of the recession. And we're going to be left at point C right here, where we are left with our original amount of GDP. We're back to our Q star level of output, but we notice that we are left with higher prices. So here we're left with PL2, and we're left with even higher inflation rates compared to where we were initially. So in this case, if the government cares a little bit more about us getting out of this recession, getting rid of this GDP gap right here, then this is exactly the method and the channels that they're going to follow along with. So if the government cares more about getting out of the recession, cares more about getting out of recession, then that's exactly where they're going to be pursuing spending increases. So they're going to want to go ahead and cause aggregate demand to increase through spending increases. It can be directly through government spending. It can be through some type of consumption spending, investment spending, or net export spending. Essentially, if they want to go from Q1 GDP to Q star GDP, they're going to want to go ahead and increase spending, increase aggregate demand in order to get out of the recession. However, this may not be the only goal in mind that the government may have. Suppose that they care a little bit more about keeping price levels stable. Then they'd actually have to go ahead and do something different instead. So let's go ahead and see what is different in this case. So suppose the government wanted to lower inflation. And this could be a goal that the government does have in mind. Suppose sometimes they care more about inflation, sometimes they care more about getting out of the recession. So if they care more about keeping inflation rates low or getting them back to their original levels, let's go ahead and see what happens graphically. So once again, we want to build up our curves. We have SRAS0, AD0, and LRAS0. We have price level, we have output. Once again, we're starting off in equilibrium at point A, PL0, and Q star. So once again, we just want to go ahead and start off the beginnings of cost push inflation. We have a negative supply shock. We're going to be shifting our SRAS curve over to the left, SRAS1. And here at point B, we have higher prices, and we're in recession once again. So Q1, and we're in recession, PL1. Higher prices, we're in recession. But now suppose that the government wants to lower inflation, keep prices back to the original point that they were at point A. What do you think they're going to have to do instead? Well, in this case, they're going to have to go ahead and lower spending or decrease aggregate demand in order to get us back to our original PL0 price levels. So here, when they decrease aggregate demand, as they shift aggregate demand over to the left towards the origin, we're going to have a shift as such. We have AD1 right here, and with our new intersection that we see right here at point C, we notice that, hey, we're right back to PL0 level of output, PL0 level of price levels. So we've successfully stabilized our price levels. We're back at exactly the price level that we need to be. But what do we notice about GDP in this instance? We go down from Q1 all the way down to Q2 now. So we get pushed back further into the recession. So there is an inherent trade-off anytime we encounter cost push inflation. And it really depends on what goals the government does have in mind. If they want to lower inflation, they're going to have to go ahead and cause aggregate demand to go down, and that's going to be through spending decreases. So just the opposite case through spending decreases. So government spending needs to go down, investment needs to go down, consumption, net exports, any one of those need to go down. Remember, they're all going to be affected by the multiplier, but that has the innate ability of keeping price levels stable or in check. So once again, the cost push inflation is a scenario that governments and countries would like to avoid because it does require a trade-off between getting out of the recession and higher inflation rates. Do we care more about inflation, or do we care a little bit more about keeping prices in check? And that's all going to really depend on government policy. And it gets a little bit more complex when we introduce the Federal Reserve, the government, all together into one. But we'll take a closer look at those as we go through chapter by chapter. So once again, this cost push inflation is going to be apparent once the negative supply shock happens first, and there's really not a good way to sort of deal with cost push inflation due to this trade-off that we have between GDP and the price level. Is there a good example or an application of cost push inflation? The best one that we have is in the United States, the 1973 to 1975 oil shock that essentially affected a lot of countries worldwide. It caused long lines for gasoline, higher prices, and a shift of the SRAS curve far over to the left. So here, during this time period, we notice that SRAS curve is shifting over to the left. It is a huge negative supply shift to the left because oil is essentially used in the production of nearly every single good, and that just raised prices over a very, very short amount of time. So cost push inflation and application. With all of this will do it for chapter number 9. Kind of another dense sort of chapter compared to chapter number 8, but this does lead us to having a very, very nice foundation for everything that we will tackle for the rest of the semester. So this aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply analysis, all these curves are going to tie together with fiscal policy and monetary policy. So be sure that you get a good understanding of everything that we did within this chapter and knowing exactly why we shift all these curves in the direction that they do. So building up your economic intuition once again. We'll go ahead and take a look at fiscal policy in our next chapter, seeing what the government can do to sort of influence the economy and seeing the sort of implications of having such a large national debt and a few of the political implications as well. So economics and politics actually tie pretty well with one another, even though they really shouldn't. So we'll go ahead and take a look at all the ins and outs of that in the next chapter. I'll see you guys there. Good job with this section.